Hi. So this week's video, we're going to talk a little bit about using subsidies to encourage higher environmental protection, more environmental quality. So we talked this week about how taxes on emissions of pollution can get us in a cost-effective way to reduce our pollution down toward the efficient level of emissions we call E star in this class usually. So pollution taxes can work. It can get us to go to the right level of emissions, and we can do it a lot cheaper than if we use command and control because we end up satisfying the equal marginal principle. So each facility, each firm is reducing pollution until the point when their marginal abatement cost is equal to the tax. That means they're all the last unit of pollution reduction at each factory is at this same level equal to the tax. That means we're satisfying the equal marginal principle. We can do the same, have the same effect by using a cap and trade program. If we set a cap at the efficient level of emissions, then firms below that cap are going to buy and sell in a market, and firms with high abatement costs are going to buy permits. Firms with low abatement costs are going to be selling permits, and they'll all basically want to buy and sell till that market price, which will end up being, in theory, the same as what the tax would be, T star, if we think about it that way. So there's some uncertainty either way, either with the price. If we use a cap and trade, we don't know exactly what the price of permits will be. There's some uncertainty about the level of emissions that we'll have if we use a tax, and both of those sources of uncertainty come from not knowing exactly what the marginal abatement cost curve looks like. We can get to the same effect by actually subsidizing reductions in pollution. So instead of taxing things, we talked about how taxes are politically toxic. What about subsidies? So we can encourage people to reduce pollution by offering them a subsidy that is actually equal to the same level T star that we would force them to pay. We can offer them that much for each unit of reduction in pollution that they do. So the government can give you $120 per ton of NOx emissions that you reduce. Instead of you having to pay $120 for each ton you emit, we pay you for each ton of reduction that you have from your current levels. That'll actually give firms the same incentive to reduce to the same level and will satisfy the equal marginal principle. So in theory, a subsidy works basically just like a tax. The money is flowing the opposite direction. It's going from the government to the firms. Obviously, this is much more palatable for regulated industry because they have money coming in instead of having to pay money. Politically, taxes are toxic, but subsidizing polluters is also often not looked upon favorably. There's a principle we talked about, the polluter pays principle, this general idea that the people who are emitting pollution should be the ones who have to pay to reduce that pollution level or to pay for damages if their pollution is causing harms. And so obviously we satisfy the polluter pays principle if we are subsidizing reductions in pollution. But theoretically, it can get us there. And a lot of clever people have thought about ways to actually combine the two. Have some amount of tax, and that money gets distributed back through some form of subsidies. You often hear about that with things like to make the electrical grid more green. How could we do it? We could tax pollution and use that revenue to support construction of more renewables, which actually leads us to what I really want to talk about on this Friday, and that is our current system of subsidies. So our current system of subsidies in the US is not exactly structured like this. So we do offer subsidies for different things. So for example, we offer tax credits for the production of large-scale renewable facilities. So for a long time, there was a producer tax credit of around 30%, which that's a pretty big subsidy, right? So 30% of the cost of a big solar farm or wind farm, you could get a tax credit for. So that is a subsidy, and if this subsidy is targeted to something that does reduce pollution, so if that renewable power is offsetting a dirty source of electricity, so something like coal, then we actually are targeting subsidies to the reduction of pollution. So there's an example of a subsidy that does kind of fit in with our theory. A lot of subsidies we have don't exactly fit into our theory. So, for example, we lease out land for oil and gas exploration and extraction, and that's a huge source of the petroleum products that oil firms use. They explore and then extract from publicly owned lands that have been leased out for the purpose. Almost all experts would agree that the lease amounts that the U.S. government charges are below market rate. So if we take that as true, then we are subsidizing oil and gas extraction by making it artificially cheap, by charging below market rate to lease to be able to explore and extract the oil and gas. We are subsidizing oil and gas extraction. Now, that is a subsidy that is related to pollution. Does that work in the same way we just talked about? We said, well, subsidies can get us to the efficient level of pollution. If you think about this one, it actually moves us in the wrong way, right? So if our subsidies are for the reduction in emissions, then we move in the right direction. If our subsidies are for the activities that lead to or closely related to emissions, then it moves us in the wrong direction. We end up with an artificially low price for these inputs that makes us want to use relatively more of them. That leads to more pollution emission. So subsidizing oil and gas extraction does not fit with our general theory that, hey, subsidies can work to get us to the efficient level of pollution. It only works if we're subsidizing reductions in pollution, not expansions of pollution. So there's a big bone to pick with current U.S. policy on a lot of things, from agriculture to energy, and it could be a whole class in and of itself. How does the U.S. government tax and subsidize different activities as they relate to externalities, environmental externalities? It would be a very specific seminar sort of course, but it would be fascinating stuff because we have a lot of policies that are around for historical reasons, for political economy reasons. There are a few of them that have been proposed and supported by economists who are thinking about the sort of things we're thinking about, but most of them were not. Most of them were created for other reasons, for industry lobby, for tax revenue purposes, perhaps, for political reasons. So there are a lot of things that we could look at with our lens as an environmental economist and say, I don't know if this tax and subsidy sort of scheme we currently have is quite the right fit if our goal is to get firms to internalize their externalities from pollution, get them to have incentives to want to move to the optimal level of pollution, where the marginal abatement cost is equal to the marginal damage caused by that pollution. So I will leave it at that. We'll be going into a discussion next week of global issues. We'll kind of start from local scale and build up to global, and talk about how a lot of these things we've been talking about, pollution doesn't care about borders, so it is happy to cross borders. We've talked about climate change. Obviously, that's a global issue. And so a lot of these are issues that cross borders. They're international, even global in scale. We'll talk about thinking about the appropriate level of coordinated response. Should local governments be running this like we do with our solid waste, or municipal solid waste trash and recycling programs? Or should this be an international body coordinating things? Should the UN or World Trade Organization or someone be doing this? So we'll be talking about those kind of topics next week. Hopefully you're thinking about potential paper topics and reaching out to me for feedback on those. I hope you guys have a great weekend. Stay safe. COVID numbers are definitely going in the wrong direction. So, and then that's heavy on my mind as we approach the end of in-person classes, and a lot of people are getting ready to go home and spend time with family around the holidays. That means it's actually a really dangerous time when it comes to potential COVID exposures. If you get exposed right now, then you are likely to develop a case that is probably going to be quite or very mild, which is good for you, but it means it could be hard to notice, and when you go back and spread it to family members, it is less likely to be so mild for all of them. So think about those externalities. It is a tricky time from a public health sense. The same discussions we'll have next week about thinking local to global. We're talking about environmental stuff. A lot of those same things could apply to things like public health, managing a pandemic. What role should local governments, Bowling Green, Warren County be playing? What role should states be playing? What role should national, federal, and what role should international organizations be playing? So we'll tie into those things. The pandemic is certainly all around us, so we have no shortage of ways to tie our topics to a discussion of that. Thanks, guys. Stay healthy.